Then let's move on to this question right here. Why did Jesus rebuke Peter by telling Satan to get behind him? Okay? All right. You say, wait a minute, did that really happen? Yeah, that really happened. Let's take a look at Matthew chapter 16. All right. I passed it. Matthew chapter 16. So, in Matthew chapter 16, we start things out in verse number 13 with Jesus blessing Simon Peter. Okay? So, in verse number 13, it says, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Okay, so Jesus just asking his disciples, who do people say I am? And they're coming back with all these questions, these answers about what they've heard people say who Jesus is. If he's John the Baptist, of course, John the Baptist already died at this point. If he's Elijah, if he's another one of the prophets, Jeremiah. He comes up and says, but what about you? Who do you say I am? Who answers? Simon Peter answers. Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, I think it was in maybe a Sunday, we were talking about Peter, and we were talking about Peter's personality. And, Peter was the kind of guy that I think spoke first. And then, sometimes you wondered why he spoke. Okay, Simon Peter is speaking, and he's speaking before everybody else, okay? And the fact that he spoke up, we see that Jesus goes and says, Jesus replied, verse 17, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this is not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And so the reason why Simon was so quick to speak up is because the Father revealed it to him that this was indeed who Jesus was. He was the Messiah, that is Christ. He was the Son of the living God. Okay? Now, even though the Father revealed it to Simon, what did it take on Simon's part to say it? Took a little bit of boldness, right? Okay? So just put a pin in that while we continue. He goes on down to say, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it, or the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Now, I know that there's a lot of people who take a lot of things from this verse that are just simply wrong, okay? This does not mean that Peter is head of the church. Who is head of the church as far as what the Bible says? Jesus is the head of the church, not Peter. Okay? It does not mean that Peter is the head or the representative of Jesus here on earth either. It does not mean that Peter is going to be there at the pearly gates with the keys and he's either going to let you in or keep you out. Okay? What does this mean? Well, okay, where he says, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The word Peter in Greek is Petra, and the word Petra means rock, okay? So he's really doing a play on words, and that he's saying, you're a rock, and on this rock I'm going to build my church, okay? Now, you remember what I said about Peter and Peter's boldness? Okay? Why do you think I came up and talked about Peter's boldness? It's because at that moment he was being a rock, wasn't he? He was asked a question and he was plainly declaring truth right then and right there. Okay? And so that was a strong statement. Now, when you look at the book of Acts, who do you see doing that? Peter. First on the day of Pentecost, right? Day of Pentecost. Holy Spirit comes, people speaking in tongues. Everybody from around Jerusalem and all the people who had come into Jerusalem was wondering what was going on and who was the one that stood up and spoke and preached the gospel to them. Peter. And what was the result? There are 3,000 people that were baptized. Okay? Then later on, when Cornelius was praying, a Gentile praying in his household, chapter 10, who was it that God sent to go preach to him? Peter. Okay? And then when everybody got upset, what did Peter do? He just simply stood up for the truth and spoke to him. Now, does that mean that Peter was perfect? No, because over in the book of Galatians, we see that Paul rebuked Peter because he's being wishy-washy and everything like that. But as far as the progression of Christianity, the progression of the gospel, we see that Peter was being a rock. Day of Pentecost, gospel opened up to the Jews. Peter, being a rock, talked about the truth. Gospel opened up to the Gentiles as well. What if Peter didn't do it? It wouldn't have happened, would it? Because, God didn't force Peter to do any of that. He did it on his own free will. So, he says, I tell you that you're a rock, and on this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And so if Peter went and bound things up in earth, didn't do it, wouldn't have happened. If Peter went and took keys and loosed them and then preached, then it would have taken place. Okay? All right. Now, none of that has to do with the question at all. But I wanted to go over that to just simply say, hey, Peter had problems, and so do we. Okay? We continue. Verse number 20 says he warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. Verse 21, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. We commonly misunderstand that the disciples understood everything about what Jesus was going to go through. We think, oh yeah, from day one, when the disciples started to follow Jesus, they knew that he was going to go to the cross. They knew he was going to die for the sins of mankind. They knew he was going to be resurrected on the third day. And really, when you look at the Gospels, you don't see that. Instead, what you see is this is getting kind of later towards the end of Jesus' ministry. This is maybe about 9 months away from Jesus' crucifixion. And from what we see in verse number 21, that from that time on, from the time that he told Peter that, Jesus began to talk to his disciples and talk to them very plainly. You go over to the book of Mark, I think it says that he spoke plainly about it. And he started to explain to them that he's got to go to Jerusalem, he's got to suffer many things, that he's going to be killed and that he's going to be raised to life. And so here he is talking about all these things and talking about all these things. And what does Peter do? Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. Why in the world would he say something like that? Right? Why would he take the Lord aside and rebuke him? He is really telling the Christ, the Son of the living God, that he just said earlier this, hey, you're wrong. Hey, this ain't happening to you. Whatever you think, whatever you're saying, just get it out of your head because you're wrong. And I'm here to tell you, you're wrong. I mean, when Peter goes and rebukes Jesus, I don't think that this was a nice little suggestion, right? I think that Peter was being very forceful in what he's saying. He is rebuking Jesus. No, you are wrong about your suffering, your death, burial, and resurrection. Okay? Now, what if Jesus would have listened to Peter? We all would be in a world of hurt, wouldn't we? Including Peter. Okay? Because if Jesus wouldn't have done that, then there would be no atoning for our sin. There would be no atoning sacrifice. There would be no forgiving of our sin. There would be nothing but hell awaiting us. And who would be happier than anybody else if that took place? Satan, because after all, Satan really does not like us. Satan hates us. And it's not that Satan is trying to get us into hell. Because if you stop and think about it, if this is where Satan's destiny is, and if he doesn't like us, why would he wanting to invite us to spend an eternity with him, right? You know, you got somebody that you just can't stand, and you're going to be inviting them to be your house guest for the rest of your time? No. Satan is not wanting to get us to hell. Satan just wants to get us away from God. He hates God so much, and he hates us so much, is that he would be wanting us to go there. And so what did he do to Jesus during his temptation? Try to get Jesus to sin so that Jesus would not be the perfect sacrifice. What is he trying to do here? He's trying to tempt Jesus to not do it. But here's the thing. When Jesus was being tempted, it was something that was being very direct. Satan was doing the tempting. When Jesus was tempting, Satan was tempted, Satan was doing the tempting. It was direct. Here is something that's indirect. Jesus is being tempted again, but instead of Satan directly doing it, who is he using? He's using Peter. And notice what Jesus says. He said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Who's the real problem here? It's Satan. And so that's why he says, Satan. He says, "You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Now, even though Jesus is talking to Satan, saying, "Get behind me," who was the one that Satan was using? Peter. And so that's how he says to Peter, but he says Satan. Okay? And what's more, is you stop and think, well, why did Peter do it? It's because he had the things of men on his mind. He was thinking, hey, Jesus is going to be the Christ, meaning Jesus is going to rule and reign, and we're going to rule and reign with him. We can't wait for that to happen. No, he can't die. He can't suffer. He can't, be raised. No, he's got to go and he's got to set up his kingdom so that we can rule and reign with him. So that's how his mind is thinking. Now, here's the thing about you and I. Here's the lesson that we need to understand, is that just as Satan used Peter to do his bidding, Satan can use us. If we went back to Peter and said, "Hey, Peter, do you know that Satan's in control of all this?" What do you think Satan was going to say? No. Okay. But was he? Yeah. Same with us. We need to understand is that if our minds are not on the right things, then we can put ourselves open to the direction of Satan. For example, in Ephesians chapter 4, it talks about how we don't need to allow the sun to set on our anger, because if we do, we give the devil a foothold, right? We start to get upset, we start to get angry, and from there, all of a sudden, Satan starts to gain a foothold on us to get us to be used in another way, okay? So if there's any lesson for us to be learned from this, we need to understand that we're vulnerable and that we've got to keep our eyes focused on Jesus Christ. Okay, you got other questions? You got comments on that one?
So you're saying Satan chose Peter as the tool because his mindset was already in that of man and not of what God needed to do.
Yep.
So he was already there,
yep.
And Satan said, "Whoo."
Yeah, and he probably had been working on it a long time, building up to that too. And by the way, we pick on Peter here, but the rest of the disciples probably were in on it too, because in other accounts in Mark and in Luke, we see that Jesus is, in fact, in verse number 24, Jesus said to his disciples, not just simply to Peter, but to his disciples. And we see that along this time period, all the disciples had a big controversy as far as who's going to be first. It's because they had in their minds the things of man, not God. Okay. Anybody else?
It shows us our humanness.
Yes.
I was gonna say, it shows our pride.
It shows us our pride.
Yeah. Shows us we got a
The projector is done.
projector is done, isn't it? Okay. Well, I think so we're done.
We're done.